A millionaire was about to go bankrupt, so he decided to jump off a building, but was luckily saved by a little girl. A few days later, he received a call that made him panic and leave everything behind, and then... The rooftop of Grant Towers was silent, save for the occasional gust of wind and the distant hum of traffic below. Rain fell in a fine mist, clinging to the steel and glass of the city, blurring the skyline into something distant and untouchable. From up here, the world seemed both infinite and meaningless, a web of shimmering light stretching far beyond the horizon, indifferent to the man standing at its edge. Nathan Grant stood motionless, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, the damp fabric clinging to his frame. His gold watch, once a symbol of everything he had built, now felt like an anchor on his wrist. He turned it slightly, watching the droplets slide across its surface before lifting his gaze. Just one step. It wasn't fear that made his breath catch. It was the absence of it. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. The decision had already been made long before he stepped onto this rooftop. It had been made the day his father collapsed in his office, the day the boardroom doors closed on him, the day he realized he had no one left to turn to. Nathan closed his eyes, inhaling sharply as the wind howled against the building. And then, arms wrapped around his waist, thin and trembling. A startled gasp escaped him as something small latched onto him with an iron grip. "Don't!" The voice was high, desperate, a child's voice. Nathan's entire body stiffened. He could feel the tiny hands fisting into the fabric of his coat, gripping with more strength than they should have. His pulse, which had been steady just moments before, stuttered violently. Another voice, this one older, rougher, called out from behind him. "Hey, step back, man!" The footsteps pounded against the wet concrete, heavy and urgent. And then another grip, a stronger hand, grabbed his arm and yanked him backward. Nathan stumbled, his feet slipping against the slick surface. His back hit the cold concrete of the rooftop, his breath punching out of him as his knees buckled beneath him. He didn't fight it, didn't struggle, didn't even try to stand. Instead, he sat there, the rain soaking into his clothes, his hands shaking uncontrollably against the rooftop floor. His vision blurred, though he wasn't sure if it was from the rain or something else entirely. His chest felt tight, impossibly heavy, as if the very act of breathing required more effort than he had left to give. The little girl who had stopped him still held onto his coat. She was small, too small, with tangled brown curls sticking to her damp cheeks. She had big, searching eyes, her expression a mix of fear, determination, and something else he couldn't name. She was breathing hard, her fingers still twisted into his coat, as if afraid he might slip away again. Behind her, a man, Roger, according to the faded name patch on his work jacket, stood watching. His face was lined with age, his hands rough from years of labor, but his expression was unreadable. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them knew him. And yet, they had pulled him back anyway. Nathan finally swallowed, his throat raw, his voice hoarse when he spoke. "You shouldn't have done that." Amber, the girl, flinched slightly at the rasp of his voice but didn't let go. You looked like..." Her words faltered, but she squared her shoulders. "You looked like my Benny before she left." Nathan's fingers twitched. "Benny?" Amber nodded. Her eyes were glassy, but her grip remained firm. "My turtle. He never came back." Nathan wanted to laugh at how cute this little girl was before he realized he wasn't. The weight in his chest pressed harder, suffocating, clawing up his throat. He tore his gaze away from her and looked at Roger instead, expecting, what? Pity? Condemnation? Some speech about life and its value? But Roger just sighed heavily and crouched down beside them, his movements slow and deliberate. "You got a name?" Nathan said nothing. Roger exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly as if he hadn't expected an answer in the first place. "All right." He glanced at Amber. Don't cry, kid." Amber didn't move. Her grip tightened, knuckles white against Nathan's coat. "You're not going to go again, right?" The question winded him. She asked it so simply, like it was something he could control, like it was something that mattered. And for the first time in months, he wasn't sure of the answer. Nathan rubbed a hand down his face, his fingers damp and cold against his skin. His entire body felt numb, drained. But the girl, this child who didn't even know his name, still clung to him like he was worth something. The thought made his chest ache in a way that was almost unbearable. She sniffled, swiping at her nose with her sleeve, then reached out and took his hand. It was small, warm, and steady. Nathan let out a slow, shuddering breath, and for the first time in a long time, he let someone hold onto him. The rooftop was quieter now, though the city below still pulsed with life. Honking taxis, the distant murmur of pedestrians. But on the terrace, the clearest sound is still the sound of flocks of birds flying by. And up here, in this small pocket of stillness, everything felt muted, like the world had paused just long enough for three people to exist in their own fragile reality. Nathan sat stiffly on the damp rooftop, his back pressed against the cold concrete barrier. His limbs felt heavy, his mind blank. The weight that had been pressing down on him moments ago hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. Still there, still suffocating, but no longer dragging him toward the edge. Amber sat beside him, her knees tucked up to her chest, her tiny hands still curled into the fabric of his sleeve. She wasn't holding on as tightly now, but she hadn't let go either. Every now and then, she would glance sideways at him, her expression thoughtful, her fingers tightening slightly, as if checking to make sure he was still there. Below them, Roger worked, moving with the slow, methodical precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He crouched beside the helipad markings, carefully tracing the faded paint with a measuring tool before shaking his head and muttering under his breath. A toolbox lay open beside him, a collection of rusted wrenches and half-used cans of industrial paint scattered across the rooftop floor. He picked up a wrench, tested the tightness of a few bolts, then pulled out a small brush and began repainting the faded lines. Amber swung her legs absent-mindedly, her shoes scuffing against the concrete. "I'm Amber," she said, breaking the silence between them. Nathan blinked. He had expected her to ask something. "Why were you trying to jump? What's wrong? Do you need help?" But instead, she simply offered her name, as if this was just another ordinary conversation. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. "Nathan." Amber beamed, as if this were some great victory. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "Grandpa! This guy's name is Nathan." Roger didn't look up. "Good to know, kid," he called back, his voice edged with mild amusement. Nathan's fingers curled slightly against the damp rooftop. The simplicity of their exchange unsettled him. No pity, no pressing questions, just a child introducing herself and an old man continuing his work. Amber turned back to him, her expression bright. "Do you work in this building?" Nathan hesitated. Worked, past tense. His company was still there, but for how much longer? "Yeah," he said finally. Amber nodded, as if that was all she needed to know. For a while, they just sat there, watching Roger paint. The old man worked without rushing, his movements steady, his presence grounding. Amber, despite her usual energy, stayed close, the occasional twitch of her fingers against Nathan's sleeve, the only sign that she was still on edge. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "You should come home with us." Nathan turned his head slightly, looking at her. She stared straight ahead, kicking at a small puddle of rainwater that had collected on the rooftop. Roger glanced up from his work, but said nothing. "My grandma makes really good stew," Amber continued, her voice light but deliberate. "Like really good. Grandpa says it's the best thing about coming home after a long day. You should try it." Nathan blinked, caught off guard. She was inviting him to dinner. It was absurd. He was a stranger, a man they had pulled from the edge of a rooftop, broken and shaking, and this child was talking about stew like that was the thing he needed most. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he looked up at the sky. The rain had slowed, but the chill lingered, settling into his bones. The city lights stretched out beyond them, but for the first time, they didn't feel distant. Amber was still watching him, expectant, hopeful. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. This was ridiculous, but when he looked at the skyline again, it felt cold, hollow, and when he looked back at Amber, he saw warmth. He exhaled slowly. "Okay." Amber grinned. Roger shook his head, muttering something about picking up strays, but there was no real irritation in his voice. Nathan didn't know why he agreed. Maybe because refusing felt harder than saying yes. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, someone had asked him to stay. Or maybe, just maybe, he wasn't ready to be alone again. The ride to Roger's home was quiet, save for the rhythmic thrum of rain against the windshield. The old pickup truck rattled as it navigated through the slick streets, the headlights casting fleeting beams onto cracked sidewalks and flickering street lamps. Inside the cab, the heater hummed softly, filling the space with a faint warmth that did little to thaw the lingering cold in Nathan's chest. Amber sat between him and Roger, her small hands fidgeting in her lap, occasionally stealing glances at Nathan as if to make sure he was still there. Roger, eyes fixed on the road, drove without speaking, the only sound between them the occasional sigh of wet tires against asphalt. Nathan kept his gaze out the window, watching the city blur past. It felt smaller from here, stripped of the high-rise glass towers and polished boardrooms he had once commanded. In this part of town, the world felt more real. Worn-down convenience stores, bars with flickering neon signs, streets that bore the weight of stories no one bothered to tell. By the time they arrived, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Roger pulled the truck into a narrow driveway beside a modest single-story house with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. The porch light flickered on as they approached, casting a warm, golden glow onto the wet pavement. Nathan hesitated at the door. This wasn't his world. He had stepped into something different, something quiet, something foreign. Amber, already inside, kicked off her shoes by the doorway and turned back to him, expectant. "Come on." He stepped in. The smell of something warm and familiar wrapped around him instantly. Stew, slow-cooked and rich, the kind that clung to the air and softened the edges of a cold evening. The house was small but alive, cluttered with mismatched furniture and shelves overflowing with books, framed photographs, and old trinkets that carried history in their dust. A woman stood by the stove, stirring a pot with slow, practiced movements. She was older, her silver-streaked hair tied back, her frame sturdy but softened by age. Her sharp eyes flicked up as they entered, settling on Nathan with quiet scrutiny, before shifting to Roger with the familiarity of decades. "Picked up another stray?" she asked, arching a brow. Roger sighed, setting his keys on the counter. "Something like that." Nathan stiffened instinctively, expecting skepticism, maybe even disapproval. But Susan, because he assumed this was Amber's grandmother, only gave him a brief once-over before turning back to her pot. "Wash up. Food's almost ready." Amber grabbed his hand before he could process anything further, dragging him toward the sink. "Here, you can use this one," she said, pulling a slightly worn towel from a drawer. Nathan hesitated, staring down at his own hands, streaked with the remnants of the rooftop's rain and grime. He hadn't realized how cold he still was until the warm water rushed over his skin. By the time he sat at the dining table, the room had settled into an easy rhythm. Roger had taken his usual seat. Susan ladled stew into bowls, and Amber bounced onto her chair, practically buzzing with energy. Nathan sat stiffly, feeling out of place among the well-worn comfort of this home. The wooden table bore the scratches of years, the chairs slightly uneven, the room filled with the quiet clatter of bowls and spoons. Susan placed a bowl in front of him. Stew, thick, steaming, rich with the scent of slow-simmered vegetables and herbs. Nathan stared at it, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. The last time he had sat down to a meal like this had been years ago. Flashback. Patrick sat at the long mahogany dining table, waiting. The food, arranged with precision, had gone cold, untouched. The grand chandelier overhead cast golden light onto an empty seat, Nathan's seat. Nathan had been too busy. Meetings, negotiations, late nights spent chasing deals instead of moments. He had convinced himself there would always be another meal, another night to sit across from his father, and then one day, there wasn't. The weight of it settled in his chest, pressing against his ribs like something too big to contain. "Hey," Amber's voice broke through his thoughts. He blinked, realizing she was watching him. Without a word, she grabbed a piece of bread, tore off a chunk, and plopped it onto his plate. Nathan swallowed hard. He picked up his spoon. The first bite was hesitant, the second easier. By the third, something in his chest tightened, then loosened, unraveling into something unfamiliar. The food didn't taste like ash. It tasted like warmth, like something he hadn't realized he had been starving for. He didn't finish the whole bowl, but he ate more than he had in days. When dinner ended, Susan and Roger fell into their nightly routine, Susan clearing dishes, Roger checking the evening news on the battered old television in the corner. Amber talked animatedly about her school, a book she had read, the cat that sometimes wandered into their backyard. Nathan listened, quiet, absorbing. Before he left, he reached for a napkin, pulling a pen from his coat pocket. He hesitated for only a moment before writing down his number, sliding the napkin across the table toward Amber. "In case you ever need anything," he said, his voice rough but steady. Amber beamed. "Okay." Roger didn't comment, but his gaze lingered on Nathan a moment longer than necessary. Nathan stepped out into the cool night, the drizzle now nothing more than a whisper against the pavement. For the first time in a long time, the city didn't feel so empty. The office felt foreign. Nathan stood in the center of Grant Towers, the empire he had built, and yet for the first time, it no longer felt like his. The vast marble lobby, once polished to perfection, now seemed dimmer, the sharp echoes of footsteps swallowed by an air of uncertainty and neglect. He walked past the reception desk, where the receptionist barely glanced up before quickly averting her gaze. Employees passed by him in the hallway, their movements stiff, their eyes carefully avoiding his. It was as if his presence carried the weight of failure, a ghostly reminder of the company's downward spiral. The elevator doors slid open with a chime, revealing the top floor, the executive offices. Nathan stepped in, exhaling slowly. He knew what he would find, but the reality still stung. Desks half empty, stacks of reports left untouched, a silence that had replaced what was once the heartbeat of his empire. Nathan had ignored it for too long. He had let his grief consume him, allowed the company to slip through his fingers while he drowned in his own despair. But now, he had to claw his way back. He strode into the boardroom. The long mahogany table, once filled with voices debating new deals, new properties, new investments, now felt hollow. He pulled a chair back and sank into it, pressing his fingers against his temple before reaching for the nearest stack of financial reports. The numbers stared back at him. Plummeting revenue, failed acquisitions, missed projections. It wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. Nathan exhaled sharply, flipping through the reports, scanning for patterns, for anything that might have warned him sooner. His eyes caught a series of discrepancies. Contracts approved without his final signature, budget allocations that didn't add up, figures that seemed deliberately buried. His grip tightened on the pages. How had it gotten this bad without him realizing it? A hesitant knock on the glass door made him look up. Julia, his executive assistant, stepped inside. She looked exhausted, her usual composure frayed at the edges. "Mr. Grant," she started cautiously, "I didn't expect you in today." Nathan set the papers down, studying her carefully. "I should have been here sooner." She hesitated before nodding. "Yes, you should have." There was no malice in her voice, no anger, just honesty. Nathan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Tell me everything." Julia walked forward, placing a thick file on the table. "You'll need to go through this first. It covers the past 6 months, declining revenue, staff layoffs, investor withdrawals. There's also—" She trailed off, shifting uncomfortably. "What?" Nathan pressed. She hesitated. "There's been talk. Employees aren't sure what's happening. Morale is at an all-time low. Some think the company won't last another quarter." Nathan nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of it. He had been gone too long. Another voice cut into the room. "Do you even have a plan?" Nathan turned to see Richard Donahue, the company's CFO, leaning against the doorway. The man had been part of Grant Enterprises for years, long before Nathan had taken over from his father. Unlike Julia, Richard's expression wasn't cautious. It was openly skeptical. Nathan leaned back in his chair. "That's what I'm working on." Richard scoffed. "Well, work faster. The board's on edge. The staff's on edge. Investors are pulling out left and right." He folded his arms. "You walked back in here today like you still own the place, but let's be real, Nathan. You haven't been here. You left this company to rot." The words hit like a slap. Nathan could have argued. He could have pointed out that he was still CEO, that his name was still on the building, that he had built every single brick of this empire. But he didn't, because Richard was right. Nathan inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay composed. "Then let's fix it." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" Nathan met his gaze. "Yes, just like that." A tense silence filled the room. Then, Richard let out a dry chuckle. "You really think you can turn this around?" Nathan stared at the stack of reports, at the numbers that told a story of loss, neglect, and failure. Then he looked up, voice steady. "I have to." Richard studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then you better start calling meetings. Investors won't wait for you to get your act together." Nathan wasted no time. He called a meeting with department heads, sat through hours of damage control discussions, and pored over contracts until his eyes blurred from exhaustion. For the first time in months, he felt alive, the fire of responsibility rekindling in his chest. By evening, his office was littered with open files, coffee cups stacked beside his desk, pages covered in frantic notes. And then, his phone rang. Nathan barely registered it at first, his mind still buried in reports, but something in the sharpness of the ringtone made him pause. He reached for the phone, frowning when he saw the name on the screen. Amber. He straightened, pressing the phone to his ear. "Amber?" Her voice came through, breathless, panicked. "Nathan, something's wrong. Grandpa's hurt." His stomach plummeted. "What happened?" I don't know," she stammered, her voice small, frightened. "There were men here. They were yelling about money. They pushed Grandpa, and he fell, and now he won't wake up." Nathan was already grabbing his coat, shoving papers aside. "I'm coming," he said, his voice sharp, certain. "Stay with him. I'll be there soon." He didn't hesitate. The company could wait. Amber couldn't. The tires screeched as Nathan pulled into Amber's neighborhood, barely registering the uneven pavement beneath him. His chest felt tight, his grip ironclad around the wheel. The street lights cast a sickly yellow glow on the crumbling sidewalks, illuminating the scene before him. Chaos. A group of men, corporate suits mixed with hired muscle, stood near a row of houses, their voices loud, their presence invasive. Families huddled near doorsteps, fear etched into their faces, their belongings scattered across porches as if they had been dragged out in haste. Nathan barely had time to process it before his eyes found Amber. She was kneeling beside Roger, her tiny hands gripping his arm, her face streaked with tears and panic. Roger was on the ground, propped against the steps of his home, his hand clutching his ribs, his breaths shallow and uneven. Nathan was out of the car before the engine had fully died, slamming the door behind him. His shoes hit the wet pavement hard, sending splashes across the cracked road as he rushed toward them. "Amber!" She whipped her head around at the sound of his voice, relief flashing across her face before her lip quivered. "Nathan! Grandpa, he—" Nathan was already beside them, his knees hitting the pavement as he assessed Roger's injuries. The older man grimaced, shifting slightly, but said nothing. His face was pale, sweat dotting his forehead despite the cool night air. Nathan's fingers curled into tight fists as he turned toward the men responsible. A tall man in a crisp grey suit stood near the front of the group, holding a stack of papers in one hand and a phone in the other, the picture of corporate detachment. Nathan rose to his full height. His voice was like steel. "What the hell is going on here?" The man barely spared him a glance, flipping through the documents. "This doesn't concern you." Nathan's rage simmered, controlled but deadly. "It does now." One of the enforcers, a thick-built man with a crooked nose and knuckles that had clearly seen their share of fights, stepped forward, chest puffed up, as if he could intimidate Nathan into backing off. "You should leave. This is business." Nathan didn't move, didn't flinch. His voice was ice. "Explain to me how business involves assaulting an elderly man." The suited man sighed, finally glancing up from the papers. "These people have failed to meet the terms of their eviction. The property belongs to the corporation now. We're just ensuring compliance." Nathan's stomach turned. Eviction? Corporation? His gaze snapped to Roger, whose pained expression was laced with frustration. "They want to tear down the whole block," he muttered, his voice rough with pain. "Offering scraps for buyouts. None of us are taking it, so they figured they'd scare us into leaving." Nathan's pulse pounded in his ears as he extended his hand, silently demanding the documents. The suited man hesitated before handing them over, as if daring him to find fault. Nathan's eyes locked onto the top of the page. Grant Enterprises. His world tilted. A sharp coldness settled in his bones. His company. His name. Nathan flipped through the pages, scanning the signatures, the approvals, his mind struggling to process the betrayal unfolding before him. He had never authorized this. Yet here it was, official. Contracts stamped, funds transferred, legal agreements binding. A single name kept appearing. Zachary Howard. Nathan's breath left him in a slow, measured exhale. Zachary, his oldest friend, his trusted business partner, the man who had stood beside him as they built Grant Enterprises together, the man who had been running things in his absence. Nathan's fingers tightened around the papers, crumpling the edges as rage curled through his veins like wildfire. Zachary had done this, behind his back. He felt Amber's small hand tug at his sleeve, her voice trembling. "Nathan, what does it say?" For a moment, he couldn't speak. He just looked at her, her wide, frightened eyes searching his for reassurance. Then slowly, carefully, he folded the papers, tucking them under his arm before crouching down to Amber's level. His voice was steady, but underneath, it was a promise. "I'll fix this." Amber nodded, trusting him instantly. Nathan turned to Roger, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "We're getting you to a hospital." The older man let out a rough breath. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Nathan's tone left no room for argument. He turned back to the suited man, stepping forward, his presence commanding. "This stops now." The man raised a single brow. "Unless you plan on undoing legally binding agreements, I don't see how you—" Nathan cut him off, his voice cold, clipped, absolute. "You clearly don't know who I am." He tossed the contract onto the wet pavement between them. The ink bled into the puddles, but it didn't matter. He had already memorized every name, every number. Tomorrow, he would burn this to the ground. Without another word, he turned on his heel, helping Roger to his feet, Amber pressing close beside them. Nathan didn't look back. This wasn't over. Nathan sat alone in his office, staring at nothing. The city glowed beyond the towering glass windows, a vast grid of lights stretching endlessly into the night. Yet, the skyline, the very same one he had built his empire in, felt distant, detached. He barely heard the hum of the city below, the muted conversations of employees still lingering in the building, and the occasional chime of a notification from his phone. None of it felt real. The papers were still on his desk. The ones with his company's logo, the ones with Zachary's signature, the ones that proved everything he had built had been twisted into something unrecognizable behind his back. Nathan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. His mind was in knots, his body wound too tight to think clearly. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of everything pressed down on his chest. And then, a thought surfaced. A place he hadn't been in years. Home. Before he could second-guess himself, he stood, grabbed his coat, and left the office. The drive was quieter than he remembered. The road leading to his childhood home was lined with old oak trees, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The houses here were older, dignified, and untouched by the ever-changing skyline of the city. Unlike the cold steel of Grant Towers, this neighborhood had a sense of permanence, a place where time slowed instead of sprinting forward. Nathan pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. The house stood exactly as he had left it, the dark outline against the sky, a stark contrast to the glow of the street lamps. The front yard was overgrown, the windows dark. No one had lived here since his father passed. He hesitated before stepping out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes sounding too loud in the stillness. His breath curled in the cold air as he made his way up the porch steps, his fingers tightening around the brass key he hadn't used in years. The lock clicked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. Nathan flipped the light switch, and a single lamp in the hallway flickered weakly before casting a dim glow over the familiar space. Everything was exactly as it had been. The worn leather couch. The bookshelves were lined with his father's favorite first editions. The coat is still hanging on the rack near the door, as if Patrick would walk in at any moment. Nathan swallowed hard. His footsteps echoed as he walked deeper into the house, each step heavier than the last. The dining room table still had the same coasters. The faint stain from a spilled glass of wine was still visible on the wood. He hesitated at the doorway of his father's office. The room was untouched, the faint scent of old paper and aged wood still lingering. Nathan traced his fingers along the edge of the massive mahogany desk, feeling the indentations from years of use. His father had spent countless nights here, poring over ledgers, reviewing contracts, always meticulous, always focused. Nathan closed his eyes, an old memory surfacing. Patrick was at the desk, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, flipping through a document as the fireplace cast long shadows across the walls. Business isn't just numbers, Nathan. It's people, it's choices. Nathan had barely listened then. He had been too young, too ambitious, too sure that he already knew everything. Now, he felt the weight of those words like a stone in his chest. He let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting toward the bookshelf. His father's old habits, everything kept in its place, organized yet lived in. He scanned the titles until his eyes caught something, a small yellowing piece of paper taped just above the nightstand. Nathan frowned. It was an address. His mind immediately recognized it, but he couldn't place why. He reached for his phone, fingers moving automatically as he pulled up maps, typing in the numbers. The screen loaded. His stomach dropped. It was Roger's house. Nathan stared at the screen, his pulse suddenly hammering. Why would his father have this address? What connection did Patrick Grant have with Roger, with Amber? His fingers tightened around the phone, a knot forming in his gut. There was something here, something his father had never told him, and Nathan was going to find out what it was. Nathan stood in Roger's living room, his body rigid, his breath slow and controlled. But inside, a storm was breaking. The house smelled the same as before. Warm spices, faint traces of old wood, the lingering scent of something freshly baked. The walls were lined with worn bookshelves, framed photographs scattered across side tables, each one carrying a history he didn't yet understand. The dim light from the single overhead fixture cast shadows that flickered against the walls, elongating the silence stretching between them. Susan stood near the kitchen, gripping a dish towel tightly in her hands. Roger sat stiffly in his chair, a fresh bandage wrapped around his ribs from the incident earlier. Amber, oblivious, was curled up on the couch, her fingers gently tugging at the hem of a doll's dress, humming softly to herself. Nathan hadn't spoken since walking through the door. Roger was the first to break the silence. His voice was rough, hesitant. "You all right, son?" Nathan exhaled slowly. His grip on his phone tightened. Then, calmly but heavily, he spoke. "Patrick Grant was my father." The weight of the words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Roger's shoulders tensed, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, but it was Susan who froze completely. Her fingers tightened around the dish towel, her knuckles white, as though holding on to something solid might stop the past from creeping back in. Nathan didn't blink. He watched them both carefully, watching for any flicker of recognition, any confirmation of what he already knew deep in his bones. Roger cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. His face betrayed nothing. But Susan, she sighed, the kind of sigh that carried years of secrets, of weight, of something finally reaching its inevitable breaking point. She placed the dish towel on the counter, pressing her palms against it as if steadying herself before turning toward Nathan. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." Nathan's chest tightened. His hands clenched at his sides, though he forced his expression to remain unreadable. "How long have you known who I was?" Susan met his gaze without hesitation. "Since the moment you walked through our door." The room felt smaller, like the air had thickened, pressing in on him. Roger leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "Might as well sit down, son. You're going to want to hear all of it." Nathan didn't move at first. His body was wound too tightly, his instincts screaming for him to stay on his feet, to fight. But then he looked at Amber. She was still playing with her doll, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding around her. The soft glow of the lamp cast a golden hue over her curls, her small fingers adjusting the doll's tiny shoes, her whole world innocent, untouched. Nathan swallowed hard. Then, slowly, he moved to sit. Susan pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her hands folding in her lap, her expression unreadable. Roger remained quiet, allowing his wife to be the one to tell the truth. Susan took a deep breath. Amber was never ours. Nathan's stomach clenched. She came to us 10 years ago. Patrick brought her here himself. The words slammed into him, knocking the breath from his lungs. His father. His father had known, had been involved. Nathan's fingers dug into the edge of the table. His voice, when he spoke, was tight and sharp. Why? Susan glanced at Amber, her eyes softening for the briefest moment before she returned her attention to him. Because her mother, your ex-girlfriend, left her, and Patrick. He didn't want you to know. Nathan's pulse roared in his ears. Everything in him froze. It was like the ground had been ripped from under him, and suddenly, nothing made sense anymore. His ex-girlfriend, Isabel. His father had brought Amber here, had left her in Roger and Susan's care. Why? Why had he hidden this from him? Susan's voice was gentle but firm. Your father told us you were young, that you were just starting your career. He said you had too much on your shoulders already, that it would destroy everything you were working toward if you knew. He didn't want to burden you. Burden. The word tasted bitter in Nathan's mouth. His father had kept his own daughter from him. Amber wasn't just some child. She wasn't just a girl he had met by accident. She was his daughter, his blood. And he had never known. The revelation hit like a hurricane, tearing through every certainty he had left. Nathan's gaze snapped to Amber. She still hadn't looked up, still hadn't realized that her entire world had just shifted. His daughter. A slow, sharp ache curled in his chest. He had spent the past weeks getting to know her, laughing with her, holding her tiny hand in his, and the whole time she had been his. Nathan swallowed, his throat tight. Who was her mother? Roger and Susan exchanged a glance, as if deciding whether to reveal the last piece of the puzzle. Finally, Susan said the name. Isabel. Nathan's hands curled into fists. It shouldn't have surprised him. The woman he had once loved. The one who had disappeared without a trace, vanishing from his life without a second glance. And she had been pregnant. She had been pregnant with his child, and she had left. Nathan sucked in a sharp breath, pressing his fingers against his temple. He needed to think. He needed to breathe. Susan's voice was softer now, careful. Your father never stopped supporting her, Nathan. He sent money every month, made sure Amber was cared for. When Isabel left, he took it upon himself to find her a home, and he chose us. Nathan shook his head slowly. It didn't make sense. His father, the same man who had pushed him to be relentless, to sacrifice everything for success, had done all of this behind his back. It was too much to process, too much to understand. Susan reached across the table, her voice gentler than before. We were never meant to keep this from you forever. Patrick said he would tell you when the time was right. Nathan let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. The time was never right, was it? Roger sighed. No, son. I guess it never was. Silence stretched between them. Nathan stared down at his hands, his mind still spinning, drowning in truths he hadn't asked for. And then, a small giggle from the couch. Amber, completely unaware. Nathan's chest tightened painfully. She deserved to know. She deserved so much more than this. But for now, he just watched her, his heart pounding in his ears, the weight of fatherhood crashing into him for the very first time. The house was quiet in the early morning, the kind of quiet that came before the world fully woke up. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old wooden floorboards, the faint chirping of birds outside. It all felt strangely peaceful. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, his fingers curled around a steaming mug of coffee, watching the light from the small window spill onto the countertops. He had barely slept. Too much had changed too quickly. Amber. His daughter. The realization still settled uncomfortably in his chest, foreign yet undeniable. He had spent years believing he was alone, that his choices had led him to isolation, that he had no real family left. But she had been here all along. His blood, his responsibility. A quiet rustling sound pulled him from his thoughts. Amber shuffled into the kitchen, still wearing her pajamas, her curls tangled from sleep. She rubbed at her eyes with small fists before blinking up at him, surprised to find him there. Nathan straightened slightly. Morning. Amber yawned, dragging a chair out and plopping down across from him. "You're still here." There was no accusation in her voice, just mild curiosity, as if she hadn't yet decided whether this was something unusual or something normal. Nathan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I am," Amber hummed, considering this as she reached for the cereal box in the center of the table. Nathan watched as she poured herself a bowl, her movements quick but uncoordinated, some of the cereal spilling onto the table. She didn't seem to care. She pushed the box aside and grabbed the sugar jar. Nathan frowned slightly as he watched her scoop 1, 2, 3 heaping spoonfuls into her bowl. His eyebrows lifted. "You sure you need that much?" Amber paused mid-scoop, blinking at him as if he had just asked something absurd. "I like it sweet." Nathan huffed a quiet breath, shaking his head. She stirred the sugar into the milk, lifted her spoon, and took a bite, only to immediately scrunch up her face in regret. Nathan smirked. "Too sweet." Amber chewed miserably, swallowing before slumping back into her chair. Maybe a little. He reached for the carton of milk and slid it toward her. "You can fix it." She eyed him for a moment before grabbing the milk and diluting her self-inflicted sugar overload. Nathan just watched her. It was such a small thing, so utterly normal, yet it struck him how little he knew about her. What was her favorite color? What made her laugh? What did she do when she was scared? What had the past 10 years of her life been like? The weight of that hit him harder than expected. Amber continued eating, oblivious to his thoughts. Nathan swallowed, setting his mug down. "So, what do you like to do?" Amber blinked at him over her spoon. "Like, for fun?" "Yeah," she shrugged. "I like drawing and reading, and I'm really good at jumping rope. Grandpa says I could be a champion." Nathan felt something tighten in his chest. He had never imagined having conversations like this. "Do you like art?" she asked, tilting her head. Nathan thought for a moment. "I was never very good at it." Amber grinned. "I could teach you." A small, unexpected warmth settled in him. "Yeah?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I can show you how to draw a cat. It's easy. You just do a bunch of circles and add triangles for ears." Nathan couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Sounds like a solid technique." Amber beamed before going back to her cereal, swinging her legs under the table. Nathan watched her, taking in every small movement, every habit. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Nathan started coming over more often. At first, it was subtle, a morning coffee that turned into lingering afternoons, small conversations that grew into longer ones. Amber adjusted to his presence quickly, as if he had always been there. She would chatter about school, about the stray cat that sometimes wandered into their yard, about how she thought the moon followed her home at night. And Nathan listened. He learned. He learned that Amber always hummed when she was focused, that she had a habit of tapping her fingers against the table when she was thinking, that she hated green beans, but would eat them if Susan gave her the look. Susan, for her part, softened toward Nathan in ways she hadn't before. She still carried a quiet wariness, but she no longer watched him as though expecting him to leave. She would set an extra plate for him at dinner without asking if he was staying. Roger, however, remained cautious. The old man would watch Nathan carefully whenever he helped Amber with her homework or sat beside her while she sketched. Nathan knew what Roger was waiting for, proof. Proof that Nathan wouldn't just show up only to disappear again. And maybe Roger wasn't wrong to be cautious. But Nathan wasn't leaving. Not this time. Not now that he knew the truth. One evening, as Amber was coloring at the kitchen table, Susan placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Nathan. He looked up at her in mild surprise. She folded her arms, leaning against the counter. "You're here a lot." Nathan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Susan studied him for a long moment before sighing. "She's getting attached to you." Nathan's throat tightened. "I know. She's never had a father," Susan said softly. "She doesn't know what that means." Nathan swallowed hard. "Neither do I." Susan's expression softened. "Then I guess you both have something to figure out." Nathan glanced at Amber. She was completely focused on her drawing, content, safe, trusting that he would be there when she looked up. He wasn't sure what kind of father he was supposed to be, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. Nathan stood in the elevator of Grant Enterprises, watching the red digital numbers tick upward. The ride felt longer than it should have, the tension in his chest building with every floor he passed. He wasn't returning as the man who had once run this company with blind trust. He was returning as a father. And he was here to end Zachary Howard. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the executive floor. The office felt different now, not just because of what he had learned, but because of the way people looked at him as he stepped forward, guarded, uncertain, like they weren't sure if they were witnessing his comeback or his final downfall. Nathan didn't hesitate. He strode through the hall, past rows of desks occupied by employees who had once revered him. Many of them avoided eye contact, others stole quick glances, murmuring in hushed voices. Nathan pushed open the glass doors to his office, and there, seated comfortably in his chair, as if he belonged there, was Zachary Howard, his so-called best friend. Zachary didn't look surprised, didn't even bother standing up. He simply smirked. "Well, look who finally decided to show up." Nathan didn't stop moving. He crossed the room with calculated steps, stopping just short of the desk. His hands were steady, his pulse controlled. But his fury burned hot. Without a word, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, slamming it onto the desk between them. Zachary barely glanced at it. "What's this? A dramatic gesture. You always did have a flair for theatrics." Nathan's voice was low, cold. "It's proof." Zachary chuckled, reclining in the chair, as if this was a game he had already won. "Proof of what exactly?" Nathan leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, staring directly into the eyes of the man who had betrayed him. "Proof that you've been bleeding this company dry behind my back." For the first time, Zachary's smirk faltered. Nathan's voice remained dangerously even. "I know about the offshore accounts." He flipped open the folder, revealing transaction logs, shell company transfers, buried financial records. "I know about the hush money, the forged contracts, the missing assets you thought no one would notice." Zachary's fingers tapped against the armrest, but his expression remained unreadable. "You think a few pages of documents are enough to—" Nathan cut him off. "And I know about the evictions." That hit its mark. Zachary stilled. Nathan's grip on the folder tightened. "I went to the neighborhood, Zach. I saw what you did." Zachary exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair before sitting forward. "Listen, Nathan, you're making this into something bigger than it is. It's just business. You—" Nathan slammed his hands onto the desk. "You sent men to intimidate families. You sent thugs to rough up an old man." His voice was low, but dangerous. "You did that under my name, under my father's name." Zachary's expression darkened. The mask slipped for just a second, and in that moment, Nathan saw it. The man Zachary had become. This wasn't the same friend who had built this company with him. That man no longer existed. This was a liar, a thief, a man who had sold out everything they had built. Nathan straightened, his voice measured. "Your time here is over." Zachary scoffed. "And how exactly do you plan to make that happen? This isn't a movie, Nathan. You can't just walk in here and—" A sudden sound interrupted him. Police sirens. The wail of them echoed through the streets below, growing louder. Zachary's smirk vanished. Nathan pulled out a final document. one signed by a judge. A formal fraud investigation, freezing all of Zachary's assets. "I didn't come here to argue," Nathan said coolly. "I came here to watch you fall." The glass doors swung open behind them, and two officers stepped inside. Zachary shot to his feet, his chair rolling back against the wall. "You—" One of the officers spoke firmly. "Zachary Howard, you're under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and corporate misconduct." Nathan didn't move, didn't blink. Zachary turned to him, his eyes filled with something dark, rage, desperation. "You set me up." Nathan's lips curled into a faint smirk. "No, Zach, you did that to yourself." The officers grabbed Zachary by the arms, pulling him toward the door. He struggled. "Nathan, you think you've won? You think this changes anything?" Nathan finally turned away from him, walking to the window and looking out over the city. "It changes everything." The sound of Zachary being dragged out of the office was the only thing Nathan had wanted to hear for a long time. And with that, he reclaimed his company. But more importantly, he reclaimed himself. The sound of police sirens still echoed in Nathan's ears as he stepped out of his office. The once busy hallways of Grant Enterprises had fallen silent, employees frozen at their desks, watching as their former CEO was dragged away in handcuffs. Zachary struggled against the officers, his voice rising above the hush of the office. "You think this is over?" His words were venomous, desperate. "You think you can take back what's mine? This company was nothing without me, Nathan." Nathan stood tall, arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable. For once, he wasn't the one drowning. He met Zachary's furious glare with cold finality. "This company was never yours." Zachary's jaw clenched, but the officers tightened their grip, pulling him toward the elevator. There was no escape now. The doors slid open, and for a brief moment, Zachary hesitated. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Not anger, not arrogance, but fear. The realization that there was no way out of this. Then the doors closed behind him, and just like that, he was gone. Nathan released a slow breath, feeling the tension begin to lift from his chest. And yet, as he turned back to face his employees, he saw it. The uncertainty still lingering in their eyes. Some had worked under him since the beginning and had watched him build this empire from the ground up. Others had only known Zachary's rule and had been caught up in his lies, believing that Nathan had abandoned them. He stepped forward, commanding the room without needing to raise his voice. "I know what you're all thinking." His tone was measured, controlled. "You're wondering if things are going to change, if Grant Enterprises can survive this." Silence. No one spoke. Nathan's gaze swept the floor, reading the doubt, the hesitation. He understood it. Then, he laid his hands on the boardroom table, looking every executive and every department head directly in the eye. "This company was built on my father's vision," he said, his voice steady, unshakable. "On integrity, on trust. That trust was broken, but it won't happen again." A murmur rippled through the room, a few hesitant nods. Nathan pressed forward. "I won't pretend this will be easy," he admitted. "But I'm not going anywhere. We're going to fix what was broken. We're going to clean up the mess left behind. And we're going to do it together." For the first time, the energy in the room shifted. The employees exchanged glances, uncertainty giving way to something else. Hope. And then, Richard Donahue, the CFO, stepped forward. He had been one of the most vocal critics of Nathan's absence, the one who had challenged him outright when he first returned. But now, he nodded, just once, but it was enough. "We'll need a strategy meeting," Richard said, his tone more professional than hostile now. "Investors will be skittish after what just happened. We need to reassure them that Grant Enterprises is still strong." Nathan didn't hesitate. "Call the board. I want everyone in that room by noon." Richard nodded. That was it. The first step back. Nathan exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. For the first time in a long time, Grant Enterprises was his again, and this time he wouldn't fail. Nathan stood on Roger's porch, hands in his pockets, the weight of the day settling in his bones. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of a television from inside. The porch light flickered, casting a warm glow against the chipped wooden panels. For years, he had been chasing something. Success, power, the next deal, the next victory. Tonight, for the first time, he wasn't chasing anything. The door creaked open, and Amber peeked out, her curls messy from sleep. "Nathan?" She rubbed her eyes. "What are you doing out here?" He gave her a small smile. "Just thinking." Amber blinked up at him sleepily. "Are you going to live here now?" Nathan hesitated. He had spent his life in penthouse suites, hotel rooms and luxury apartments, never in a house that felt like home. He looked down at her, this small, brilliant piece of his father's legacy. And for the first time, he had his answer. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I am." Amber smiled, then grabbed his hand. "Okay, but tomorrow, you have to help me with my science project." Nathan huffed a quiet laugh. "Science, huh? What's it about?" Amber grinned. "The moon. Did you know it makes the ocean move?" Nathan squeezed her tiny hand. "Yeah, kid. I did." And as she dragged him inside, the warmth of home wrapped around him like a promise. The house was new, but it already felt lived in. Nathan stood in the doorway of the bright blue bedroom, watching as Amber twirled in the center of the space, her arms stretched out, her laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls. "This is the best room ever," she declared, flopping onto her bed with exaggerated dramatics. Nathan smirked, arms crossed, as he leaned against the doorframe. "Yeah? You sure you don't want to add more blue?" Amber gasped. "Do you think I should? Maybe glow-in-the-dark stars, too?" Susan's voice floated from down the hall. "Absolutely not. You're not turning this place into a neon nightmare." Amber giggled, flopping onto her pillow. Nathan watched her, his chest tight with something foreign, something warm. He had never imagined this, watching his daughter settle into a home he had given her. Roger walked past the room, a box in his hands. "This your way of telling me I'm officially retired?" Nathan snorted. "Would it kill you to take it easy for once?" Roger grumbled, but didn't argue. The truth was, he was relieved. After years of scraping by, fixing what was broken just to make it last a little longer, they finally had a real home. For all of them. Nathan had bought the house outright. Not a penthouse, not a cold modern apartment with empty spaces and expensive furniture. A house, with a porch big enough for Roger's rocking chair, with a kitchen where Susan could cook, without worrying about a stove breaking down. With walls Amber could paint whatever color she wanted. A place that, for the first time, felt like it belonged to them. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling as he looked down the hall. The weight on his shoulders, the one he had carried since the moment his father died, since the moment he almost walked off that rooftop. It wasn't there anymore. That evening, they gathered around the dining table. It was simple. No expensive wine, no business talk, no cold silences filled with numbers and missed dinners. Just food, laughter, and the quiet hum of belonging. Amber sat beside Nathan, swinging her feet as she talked animatedly about school. Roger grunted about how the neighbors were already nosy, and Susan scolded him between bites of roasted chicken. Nathan just listened. He had spent so many years in silence. In boardrooms, in empty apartments, in cars that took him from one deal to another. And now? Now there was noise. Good noise. Amber nudged his arm suddenly. "Hey," she said, her voice full of mischief. Nathan arched an eyebrow. "What?" She grinned, then picked up a serving spoon and plopped an extra helping of mashed potatoes onto his plate. "You need to eat more, Dad." Nathan froze. The word, so small, so simple, hit him harder than he expected. Dad. It wasn't the first time she had said it, not really, but it was the first time it felt real. Nathan swallowed, staring down at his plate. Then, slowly, he smiled, genuine, full. For the first time, he understood. This was where he belonged. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.